Suffering, the experience of human misery, is hardly new. The Lisbon Earthquake of 1755 marks a sort of beginning, an end of an old age, beginning of something new. And I call your attention to various things that are going on in the painting, the angels, the cross, the crucifix. This was very much understood as a disaster, but in an important sense, not an emergency. And it comes near the beginning of the modern era. And I want to take the idea of the humanitarian emergency, the emergency imaginary, as an example to talk a bit more about how modern social imaginaries, as Chuck has laid out the idea, might work and how they get produced and reproduced and shaped and what's distinctively modern about them. To begin with, in the case of the Lisbon earthquake, there were international responses, as there often are to humanitarian emergencies. Aid reached Lisbon in only just over 2 months, right? In other words, not in the kind of urgent, immediate sense of response that we think of today, and very much from specific partners, Britain, which was a partner of Lisbon's in trade, and so forth. This was an occasion, thus, for charity, but not really for humanitarian action as we think of it today. And so I begin with what has changed, what makes for an imaginary that helps to define and is defined by the modern era. Right? There's no answer to this question simply in terms of something fully external out there in the world, the brute facts to which we respond. That's the whole point. There have been tragedies of this kind throughout history. We don't respond to them in the same way. Nor do we get at this adequately through the response that human beings feel, the direct and immediate response of sympathy, the various ways in which we feel there but for the grace of God go we. It's not just innate human potential. Certainly it's not an unmediated expression of this innate potential understood as individual, but it's also not very well understood in the way in which David Hume and Adam Smith both tried to understand the example of an earthquake in China and its sort of attenuating sympathy with distance through various social circles. We need a new concept. And we need to understand a new social imaginary at work, a way of seeing the world that shapes reality, that is constitutive in the ways that Chuck has talked about it, that is neither simply an observation nor an illusion, that is produced and reproduced in the interplay among language, imagination, culture, practical action. And I'll stress in particular that the connection to practical action is crucial in this. Chuck has laid out ideas of social imaginary prominently in one relatively short book intended for a broad audience, not in one of his larger books. And with Chuck, when you say larger books, you really mean it. But this is actually a concept which is very close to a range of ideas that he's been exploring throughout his career, that picks up from the early work against mechanistic explanations of behavior, the rule-governed explanations, that thematizes the issues of language, of background understanding, drawn from phenomenology, the idea of embodied knowledge of relation to practical action. One of the first things that Chuck stresses in the book, Modern Social Imaginaries, is that the standpoint is not that of observation, not that of theory. This is akin to earlier work from self-interpreting animals. It's very importantly related to the multiple modernities work that Chuck did, which takes up the idea that there are different ways of inhabiting the modern. They follow different paths. The idea of incommensurability, which has already been discussed here in deep cultural difference, which I'll come back to, hypergoods. All of these sorts of things are importantly connected here. Chuck's proximate sources include borrowing a phrase from Cornelius Castoriadis, but not a great deal else. This is not the same sort of psychoanalytic explanation. Borrowing inspiration from Benedict Anderson's account of imagined communities, But going beyond this, I think, in important ways, by taking up the notion of how something more dynamic is going on that connects from the individual level, that is not just equivalent to saying culture and works through history, that has an element of performance in it, and as I'll suggest, a connection to action. Well, I didn't spend much time on that list, but the point is that Chuck is both hedgehog and fox, that all of those things could be looked at as several different themes in his work, yet they are all closely integrated in a core statement. I want to add that this is closely tied up to the idea of historical explanation and various scattered comments, for the most part, that Chuck has made on this. I'm sure that eventually he will write the philosophy of history, and it will appear in multiple volumes, but he has made important claims that are closely connected to this idea that paths matter, the paths into the present and the openings forward, that the past is reconfigured but not entirely lost in this as it shapes multiple modernities and open futures. He's linked intellectual history closely into more general accounts of historical explanation, and in particular stressed the ways in which people solving what appear to them as problems in their lives produce a history that they do not entirely anticipate, and dealt with the anachronistic problems of explanation. For example, the many thinkers of the 17th and 18th century who were working within largely religious frameworks, solving problems in those religious frameworks, yet helping to produce a secularism they would never have intended, so that secularism grows within religion as well. And this relates to the extent to which, at the very personal level, the making and claiming, this very discussion we just had in the previous session of self, is itself embedded in history, not isolated from it in this way. It's also related to his discussion of epistemic gain, his arguments over a long period of time against traditional epistemology as a search for certainty, and his argument against the idea of abstracting more or less static truths from their context, from practice, and formulating these as propositions describing an allegedly external reality. We've talked enough about that already in the conference that there's no reason to go on at length about this, or his stress on the importance of best available accounts, knowledge and action. But let me add to the discussion yesterday between Chuck and Dick Bernstein about the fusion of horizons, that this is very importantly, I think, in Chuck's work and in the phenomenological tradition he brings into his work, understandable only in action, not understandable entirely in conversation. There was a moment in the exchange, in the question and answer after Dick's talk, where it was agreed that, thinking of the two communities of language in Quebec, that the answer is let's talk, that the answer is we just need conversation. But it seems to me crucial that the answer is, in fact, shaped by the kinds of action in which people are drawn into relationships with each other. A program of national conscription in Canada is a different sort of context for practical action with consequences in people's lives, producing successive conscription crises and so forth, than an academic seminar. And therefore, we have to think about the way in which the systems in which we're acting, the larger context of politics in which we're acting, and the immediate relationships in which we're acting are pivotal for this, and the ways in which transformations take place in self and or in larger culture. We can think about this as involving a sort of disagreement among friends that I've seen enacted more than once. I've seen it enacted sometimes with both Chuck and Jürgen Habermas present, and sometimes at dinner with Jürgen Habermas, and he says, "I'm trying to understand. Chuck is really a believer, isn't he?" And yes is arguably the answer, but it's part of the misunderstanding and the disagreement between friends, because part of what is going on in a discussion about religion between Chuck and Jürgen is the extent to which Jürgen understands religion to be a matter of a set of propositions, understands religion to be a matter of a set of propositions in which people either believe or don't. and therefore understands issues of relations across religious boundaries as matters of translation, because after all, if religion is a set of propositions about the world that are either true or false, you can translate them or render them meaningful. I've seen this argument enacted in New York in a really interesting way, and I will transition back to my main theme with the account of this, only a third party intervened. So Chuck and Jürgen had an extended discussion, and it turned in some part on the question of whether other kinds of cultural differences were as deep and significant as religion. And Jürgen said, no, religion's completely different. It involves people giving reasons that could not be considered seriously by non-believers. There are lots of ways in which cultural differences are deep. I have, over some time, tried to argue with Jürgen that this is partly a matter of social imaginaries, of practical engagements with the world and the way in which people feel and understand it differently, of emotion, of rhetoric, and so forth. After Chuck and Jürgen, Cornel West spoke. Some of you will know Cornel West. He said, I'm a jazz man of the mind and a blues man of the soul. And he began a rhetorical performance as a Southern Baptist minister. And Jürgen leaned over and said, is that what you meant? Social imaginaries are embodied in images, in ritual, in physical movement in the world. Religion has a music, not merely a set of propositional statements. It is embodied in rhetoric, which is not entirely the same as rational critical argument, propositions, beliefs, and so forth. Now let me go back to humanitarian emergencies and finish up my talk, or whatever I get to in the time limited. So what is new and what helps us construct an imaginary that sees distant suffering in a way very different from how it was seen before the modern era, and even in a more immediate way that shapes the last 30 or 40 years is very distinctive? Well, we're less likely to accept fate as an adequate explanation or literally blame disasters on the stars or on divine retribution. As I said, history lives on. It doesn't go away entirely. That's a picture of Sharon Stone saying that the Sichuan earthquake was retaliation, divine retribution against China's treatment of Tibet. And that's a picture of John Hagee, advisor to the American presidential candidate, John McCain, as he condemns New Orleans, saying that Hurricane Katrina was just retribution for licentious sexual behavior. So it's not that everybody has changed completely in all of their ideas, but to a very large extent, we work in an immanent frame. That is, as Chuck's outlined, we believe in material causes, and we believe in our capacity to take action in this world of material causes, to help in ways that are so organized. The emergency imaginary, a particular social imaginary I want to suggest, complementing those Chuck has talked about in other contexts, the public sphere, the market, the citizen, and so forth, consists of the idea that there is a normal course of life, a normal course of the functioning of social systems that is occasionally disastrously interrupted by events that produce massive human suffering. These events are sudden, unpredictable, short-term exceptions to some allegedly normal global order, and they compel response. Now, it's an imaginary, it's a way of thinking about the world that shapes very important actions in the world, what we do or don't do in relationship to a variety of events. But it starts with a construction like the idea that there is a normal course of life to which there are exceptions, right? The idea of a normal global order might possibly be an oxymoron, but in any case, it's a tendentious concept. And so the emergency is not just bad things happening. In this imaginary, distant human suffering is ethically compelling to strangers. We understand obligations to humanity at large, and in a way as a whole, not just to lots of people, but to everyone. In some sense, action seems urgent, and we suspend long-term considerations of politics and economics. Now, I'm going to very quickly allude to, not go through in detail, three sort of stories about this. And my role here as a sociologist, not a philosopher, is to tell you how many traffic lights there are in Tirana. That is to say, to try to substantiate an empirical account of how things work, though I'll be really quick and suggest this. that how this imaginary works, and I'm intending to point to the general idea that imaginaries are reproduced outside of propositional statements to a large extent, has a lot to do with media. I'll explain that. Has a lot to do with histories of trying to be good to strangers and understand what that would mean, and it has a particular period. So quickly, simultaneity, right? The media are critical. Mass media, particularly visual media, shape this. It extends into social media. It extends into other arenas. The images are familiar. They involve natural disasters, technological events, as well as civil wars, humanly produced disasters. They organize our views such that we see perpetrators and victims, and almost all the images of humanitarian emergencies organize perpetrators and victims as views. They organize perpetrators as male. They organize victims as women and children. This operates in a circulatory system from Rwanda to Sri Lanka, Colombia to Congo. The images crucially represent strangers. In quantitative research on this, one of the things you find is they almost never contain identifying symbols of national identity, people in uniform, or people who are wearing any sort of specific markers, as opposed to sort of general identification as being distant. They're usually seen in series rather than as individuals, and this is part of the reproduction of a way of thinking about all of these people. And the images are remarkably interchangeable. Darfur becomes a key example. So we have a whole production in this sort of mass media that shapes the way we think, but also makes the distant suffering seem very immediate. Passing quickly through this, the immediacy is very central, right? But it's misleading some of the time. There are long warnings. In the case of the Haitian earthquake, there were seismic predictions over a pattern of weeks, as well as there were long-term factors like the location of Port-au-Prince on a fault line, grossly overpopulated, at risk, and so forth. It's not just a sudden, unpredictable event, but think of the emergencies of the Palestine situation or the partition of India. These can hardly be described as sudden, unpredictable, and short-term, and yet they are repeatedly constituted this way in the imaginary. Now, good strangers, very quickly. Humanitarians focus paradigmatically on strangers, and it's one part of a larger pattern in modern social imaginaries which attempts to take hold of the world and give an account of all of the people simultaneously in the world, the strangers as well as those to whom we're connected in various ways. And there's a lot of discussion I won't follow. This goes with the Red Cross, and it underwrites the idea of neutrality. Because humanitarian action is involving strangers, it is precisely not taking sides traditionally in conflicts and caring for all those who are injured, who are suffering. It channels an ancient norm of charity, and here again the theme that Chuck has often brought out of a sort of path-dependent relationship becomes clear as charity is both drawn on but reworked in the context of humanitarian action. This ranges from and runs across a variety of different issues. There are very old ideas like the parable of the Good Samaritan about care for strangers, but there are transformations in the modern era. One of the first modern humanitarian movements is the anti-slavery movement. The anti-slavery movement is organized not only by slaves seeking liberation and former slaves closely and personally connected to the experience, but by a variety of Christians, Methodists in particular, and others, seeing an issue of sin on a national scale, seeking to change it, and seeing connections. I call your attention to the banner at the bottom of there with the slogan, famous slogan, "Am I not a man and a brother?" But notice the two different images of the global there, one of them a category of belonging to humanity, the other a specific rhetoric of connection from the religious tradition. The human is not a self-evident category, so as it feeds into the humanitarian emergency and the emergency imaginary, we have the human understood as a set of equivalent individuals, a very unusual way to think of the human, by no means the dominant way in which this has been conceived in the past. Problematic in this context because it encourages such things as a reduction, as Agamben puts it, to the notion of bare life, to merely the minimum condition of life saved, life lost, rather than a fuller, deeper account of being human, such as those that Chuck's brought out in his work. This has a long history too. History of debating who is human. Are the natives of the New World human? The Valladolid controversy and the debate. Are the indigenous inhabitants of the Americas natural slaves? Are they people with souls? How do we respond to them? There's a long struggling through the colonial era to figure out relations to the rest of the world that has much in common with humanitarian action, even though we understand humanitarian action as the direct exercise of a moral imperative today. It's bound up with complicated things, like the idea that the natives can't govern themselves, the specific emphasis on cruel practices toward women as a justification for international intervention, and so forth. So there's a history that is occluded by the conventional way of thinking about this. But humanitarian action is also a matter of capacities. It's a matter of technological and other ways in which we see things getting done, and a matter of an image of progress. Humanitarian reform reflects a history of rationalization. Humanitarian action reflects a history of rationalization and reform in the West. It's visible, for example, in the way tents are lined up in refugee camps. When I say a social imaginary here, I mean nobody said, let us put all the tents in neat rows. And nobody organized the traditional villages from which these people were refugees in those neat rows. These villages had a very different layout, but there is, in the context of this, a way of imagining. Part of what is going on in the humanitarian emergencies is bringing order into chaos in a way that is constructed. There's a long history in this kind of managerial orientation to chaos in the world. It helps to give rise to social science. And early, this is the first president of the American Sociological Association saying that reforming humanitarian institutions is precisely why we have a discipline of sociology, because we need this and we must rationalize the way in which we try to respond to moral evils. Colonial administration played a great role in this. And I'm all just illustrating in part, I mean, I have a particular story, but I'm in part just illustrating the issue of the way in which several paths influence it. And disasters in the colonial era are tremendously shaping, much more than we realize, for the way in which we respond to disasters today. And the way in which our very attempt to be good involves a division of the world into actors and acted upon, the white people who go to Africa to save the natives. Now, let's look briefly and in closing at this sort of phenomenon. Humanitarian action takes off a little bit in the late 19th century with the Geneva Convention, more with World War II and the refugee crises, but overwhelmingly in the 1970s when it is conceptualized, as in the founding of Médecins Sans Frontières, as not politics, not economics, a way to take direct ethical action in the world, a way to locate yourself in the world as a good person. Right? This problem of ignoring politics and economics is an issue. It figures in more problematic moral campaigns of various kinds that attempt to find direct action. The traditional religious idea, Catholic idea in particular, of witness is channeled in important ways. Here's Jim Orbinski of Canada's Médecins Sans Frontières. Obviously, witnessing to brutality, not directly ending it. Right? And it's shaped by a loss of faith in other social imaginaries, a social imaginary of development, of political progress, of revolution. Right? We have to ask if the founder of Médecins Sans Frontières, who said it was necessary to escape from politics, stayed out adequately. It's a romance. It has a history in relation to this, and I will close with saying it's reproduced in a variety of registers. It's reproduced, for example, in a whole genre of films in which white guys save Africans that flourished particularly in the 1990s and are in attenuation, and I will suggest that the whole imaginary is in crises. These are films in which, ironically, violence is repeatedly justified and intervention called for that underpin an idea of the West intervening in countries to solve emergencies, and in which dramatic structures empower individuals. Bruce Willis can do it all by himself, well, with a gun, right? And in which the idea of individual action is put at the center as distinct from larger systemic transformations. It happens that these tend to be anti-heroes who are transformed by their love relationships with women who turn them into actual heroes in order to be able to carry out the humanitarian action. And the only non-macho film in the entire genre is one that narrates a story of catastrophic failure to act, and it's also the only one that has a person of color in a significant starring role. In fact, humanitarian action is largely about logistics, though the Imaginary is not. It's about supply chains, it's about log frames in which you're required to fill out all sorts of complicated accounts of what you do. It's not just an adventure, all right? But declaring a humanitarian emergency is a way of authorizing outsiders to act. And so the Imaginary has enormous consequences. It is about crises imagined from the point of view of Cosmopolis, despite the fact that 90% of all effective aid in humanitarian emergencies is provided by fellow citizens, by neighbors, by family, by friends, and by local healthcare workers. International assistance accounts for a relatively small fraction, yet that is what is being reproduced in the larger Imaginary of the story. Where does this leave the people enduring humanitarian emergencies? It leaves them, I think, as suffering masses, much more than agents with a voice. And therefore, we need to ask a bit about potentially reimagining this Imaginary. Thank you.